Allegra Kelly is a classical soprano from San Francisco whose voice offers, quote, sophistication beyond her years. Her musical versatility stretches from the Baroque and 19th century Romanticism all the way to minimalism of the music of today. She has sung in a variety of languages that range from Italian, French, and German to Czech and Spanish. Ms. Kelly's past performance engagements have included San Francisco Opera, San Francisco Symphony, Opera Parallel, San Francisco Conservatory of Music, Wind Ensemble and Opera, San Francisco Opera Guild, and others. She's collaborated with the Knights Chamber Orchestra, Gustavo Dudamel, and the Simon Bolivar Orchestra of Venezuela, the Philip Glass Ensemble, Deborah Hoyt, Federica Bonchada, Kronos Quartet, Voices of Music, and more. Ms. Kelly has a bachelor's degree from a Bachelor of Music from the San Francisco Conservatory of Music and is currently pursuing her master's of music in vocal performance at the University of Denver's Law School. Ms. Kelly will speak to us today on Mozart's Ponte operas and the Elusive bel canto. So please join me in welcoming Allegra Kelly.
Today. So there's been a lot of literature on Mozart and or bel canto, but with the exception of the Herman Klein essay and the doctoral dissertation by Margaret Smith Fransone, they either only mention one of these two concepts or regard them as completely separate entities. The scope of this presentation is to look at Mozart's Da Ponte operas and bel canto in the same vein. Look at them as connected. My thesis is that Mozart's Da Ponte operas and the singers who performed it during his lifetime embodied the ideals of 18th century Italian opera and therefore should be considered an aspect of its most mysterious invention, the bel canto. We will be doing this through first analyzing what bel canto is, then doing a musical analysis on the compositional style of Mozart's Da Ponte operas, then looking at the similarities between the two. Finally, we're going to look at some important counterpoints and provide some discursive responses to it. So what is bel canto? The scholarly definition states that bel canto refers to a vocal technique that was created within 17th and 18th century Italy that was meant to highlight the beauty and virtuosity of the human voice. Now, this is pretty common because it was only explicitly referred to as bel canto in the 19th century as a nostalgic term, despite it emerging in the 17th century alongside the invention of opera. According to late English tenor David Gallagher, its origins come from the emergence of an emotionally based singing style known as cantare affetto, as contrasted with an earlier polyphonic style called cantare la gorga. It was said to be popularized by Castrati in the 17th century. If people do not know what Castrati is, it refers to men mutilated for the sake of their voice. We're not going to go into this for the sake of time for this presentation, but it's important to note. But one thing is, it's very connected with opera and its invention, as said from this wonderful quote by Cornelius Reed. With the invention of opera in 1601, a more spectacular outlet was provided for vocal display and the virtuosity of the singers made more apparent. Now, it reached its height in the 18th century, but it's debated exactly when. Margaret Smith Fransone stated its height was late 17th century and early 18th century due to evidence of fluidity in Bach and Handel compositions, which may be inspired by Italian conventions. She said that it more declined in the late 18th century and early 19th century. On the other hand, Cornelius Reed stated that its height was the early to mid-18th century, alongside the careers of famous castrati like Farinelli, and heavily embellished vocal compositions that were meant to show off the voice, but may have led to a decline in the dramatic action of the operas. So what makes it a technique? The first thing is through contemporary bel canto singers of the time. Bel canto singers of the 18th century and 17th century also taught and composed as well as performed, and they would write treatises that would describe the voice techniques of the time, or in the case of Caccini, gave explicit pedagogical instructions. The three most well-known bel canto treatises that still exist today is the Nuova Musica by Giulio Caccini, observations on the floor song by Pietro Francesco Tosi, and practical reflections on the figurative art singing by Giovanni Battista Mancini, each of which sang, performed, and taught. Then, in the 19th century, two new vocal pedagogues started to emerge by the names of Matilde Marchesi and Emmanuel Garcia Jr. They both taught a style of singing that was called they called the bel canto method, that they said was based off of 18th century singing tradition. And they also wrote teaching manuals that gave directions on how to learn these techniques. In Marchesi's theoretical and practical vocal method, she included physiological description of basic singing tasks and voice exercises. Garcia also did so on his Hints of Singing, but stated pedagogical methods for achieving what he called the 8 essentials, which are the ideals of bel canto, what is wanted in a bel canto voice. According to both Klein and Fransona, who Klein was a student of Garcia, they had to have efficient breathing, efficient resonance, vowel clarity, sostenuto or sustained tones, legato and phrasing, portamento and messa di voce, which are two very high-level ornaments, agility, expressivity, and tonal beauty. In sum, their singing had to be well-functioning, efficient, and incredibly virtuosic, meant to highlight the voice. We have an example of a bel canto singer who is Australian soprano Nellie Melba, who sang in the 19th century. She was actually a student of Marchesi, and here is an edition of her Voi che sapete from Le Nozze di Figaro that was recorded in 1910. So we can hear that she is her singing is completely even throughout. It is seamlessly registrally connected. Everything sounds like it's meant to show off her voice, which is absolutely amazing. So now let's look at Mozart's Da Ponte operas. The Da Ponte operas refer to 3 operas that were created in collaboration with a famous librettist by the name of Lorenzo da Ponte. It is known as Le Nozze di Figaro, Don Giovanni, and Così fan tutte, which were incredibly popular at the time they were released and continue to be today. But they also were really innovative through Mozart's developing of a compositional style that heightened both the drama of the story and the singers who performed it. He did this first through form. According to musicologist Edmund Goering, Mozart started experimenting with the comic opera form, or opera buffa. His early opera buffa was more structurally rigid. The action happened in long passages of recitative, as it was written in an opera seria structure, the dominant type of opera structure at the time. The emotional turmoil, though, was expressed in arias, and this was all done over a static basso continuo, leading to rhythmic and harmonic rigidity. We have another played example from La Fin Semplice, one of his early Italian styles. Which, as we can hear, the harmonics kind of stay in the same place. Everything is very standardized and very categorized and very rigid. Now, this is completely contrasted with Mozart's Da Ponte operas, which were more structurally fluid. They were instead written in a periodic structure. This allowed more harmonic variation, more ensembles showcasing action, and rapid changes in both harmony and rhythm. And these would allow for dramatic action to be heightened and comedic elements to be shown better, aka the joke falls in the right place. We have another example, because the best way to find this is to hear it. And this is from the Don Giovanni graveyard scene, where Leporello is trying to invite the statue of the Commendatore to dinner. There's a harmonic change, completely different. And now, suddenly, he's able to be much more flexible. And we can hear this even within just a few seconds, that he is rapidly switching between keys, between harmonies, which is extremely innovative for the time. He also had, let's look at the ensembles themselves. Remember how I said that we were including more ensembles? In La Finta Semplice, one of his early operas, there were 26 total musical numbers, aka some pieces that are not recitative. 21 of which are arias. There are only 5 non-aria numbers. In Le Notte di Figaro, the first of the Da Ponte operas, there is much more ensemble action. There are 5 duets, 2 trios, 1 sextet, 3 choruses, and 2 finales. Finales is when both supporting and principal roles all get together and sing all together at the same time at an act's end. This continued on through the 19th century, which we'll get to in a bit. This allowed for more character interaction and therefore more plot development to happen. Mozart also, on a more micro scale, started composing different structures of his arias. His early opera arias were da capo form, A, B, A prime, where the second A section, or the return, refers to a bunch of, hence the name da capo, from the head, is a sign, and it would be heavily embellished. Mozart's later operas, though, featured a variety of aria structures. Some examples is Susanna's Act 4 aria, De Vieni non tardar, which is an A-B form, a binary form, with recurring motivic material from the A section throughout, but it never fully returns. Or Batti Batti o bel mazzetto, which is an A prime B form. That is a transitory period, an A prime with more embellishment, and a contrasting B section as shown by a meter change from 6/8 to 2/4, and a tempo change from andante grazioso to allegro, which is very interesting. And keep in mind the concept of a cavatina cavalletta, because we'll also be coming back to that. Finally, let's look at his vocal lines. Mozart is known for his notoriously difficult arias. They feature both long and sustained passages, florid passages, all in one aria. Our case study is Come scoglio I molto resta, which I think the Professor Woody has sent out via the handout. There are 2 sections that I have featured. These are a long sustained passage and a florid passage, both in the same aria. In the long sustained passage, this is from measures 116 to the end, where there is the single line, non vi renda audaci ancora, which is done primarily on whole notes over 6 full measures, which requires incredible breathing stamina to be able to make it through that phrase. And she's not even done. Fiordaligi is done. She repeats audaci ancora 3 more times on half notes throughout the upper middle to the high part of her voice range before ending the aria. Then, on the other side, there is measures 94 to 101, a florid passage with extensive coloratura on one word, speranza, or hope. These feature rapid triplet patterns and also jumps throughout the voice range from the upper high part down to the bottom and back up again, also requiring an incredible level of vocal skill and control. Finally, let's look at his concept of improvisation. During Mozart's lifetime, singers would improvise cadenzas, ornaments, and even full passages, which is far more than singers today. Mozart was aware of this, and his operas accommodate this, as seen from this quote by Bandie Dorian. When Mozart composed either for himself or professional colleagues, he often dispensed with specific instructions concerning anything from the performance of dynamics and other expressive markings to the insertion of cadenzas and embellishments. At times, he even omitted textual elements, which by modern-day standards are considered integral to the fabric of a composition, simply to give the singers freedom. But he would provide some hints for embellishment in the music, which include notated embellishments on repeated material, or notated heavy embellishment within simultaneously occurring orchestral lines. So if the orchestra was playing the same melody, he would put a bunch of embellishment to give a hint to the singer. But there's a note that singers were expected to be well-versed in different ornaments and how to embellish your line, even if it wasn't expressly notated. So there's so much information that we will not be able to find from the score because it was simply influence. So let's look at these similarities. The virtuosity displayed in his Ponte operas correspond directly with bel canto ideals, which I decided to show in red. Having both florid and sustained passages meant that the singer needed to have efficient resonance to be able to maintain the same vocal quality throughout everything that they're singing. Heavily embellished passages require agility and expressivity, and longer sustained passages require legato, sostenuto, ability to sustain the tone beautifully. And accommodating vocal lines for improvisation encourages the singer's expressivity. Each of these skills emphasize a singer's tonal beauty, the goal of bel canto, and the clarity of tone. Now, let's look at the ranges. I kind of have been talking about the voice ranges required. Singers needed even registration, or an ability to go between the different registers of their voice to accurately sing his Ponte operas, because they feature extended ranges and extremely difficult tessitures. In Come Scoglio e Molto Resta, the sustained section the tessitura is about an F5 to a B flat 5. The upper middle passaggio to the topmost part of this, to the high part of the singer's range. Maybe not the top, but definitely the higher area. Measures 94 to 101, features a range of B3 to F5, nearly 2 octaves in just that one section alone. In Non mi dire from Don Giovanni, the range is from F4 to B5, again, more than an octave. The tessitura is in the upper passaggio, a notoriously difficult part for any of the singers in the room. About a D5 to a G5, and as a singer, that is a difficult place to keep the intonation going for that entire aria. There's also some biographical connections between Mozart and bel canto, as Mozart was exposed to bel canto methodology throughout his training as a student. Between 1770 and 1772, Mozart went on 3 different tours to Italy and ended up living and working there for nearly 2 to 3 years. I realized I forgot to include the number on the slides. Sorry about that. About 2 to 3 years. This was when bel canto was at its height in the turning to the late 18th century. And he composed a variety of works, including 3 operas during that time, performed regularly, and became a member of the Accademia Philharmonica. He was surrounded by bel canto singers and composers who also composed according to Italian opera conventions, including seeing bel canto soprano Lucrezia Adjugati perform in Parma in 1770. As a result, it is said his music was in an Italian style deeply colored by Italian opera in accordance with bel canto traditions. Finally, he would write operatic roles with specific singers in mind. And these singers, particularly for his Ponte collaborations, were trained in the bel canto style. An example is Elusive Weber, who was the first Zerlina in his 1789 production of Don Giovanni. She was considered one of the most extraordinary singers of Mozart's time, according to Kalk and Klein, and was equally expressive, another bel canto ideal, in both recitative and aria, as said by this wonderful quote by Hermann Klein. Aloysia did justice both to the recitative and the aria, and in order to do this, she must have been equally marvelous as a dramatic and coloratura singer, expected from a bel canto singer, who he directly wrote. Finally, let's look at some counterpoints, because there are 2 very important ones. First, in recent performing circles, there is a secondary definition of bel canto, stating that bel canto is an early 19th century opera repertory associated with the three composers Gioacchino Rossini, Vincenzo Bellini, and Gaetano Donizetti. This is backed up only by the most recent entry in New Grove Dictionary of Music and Musicians. Now, despite the support from the New Grove, there's no other scholarly sources that support the definition. And the New Grove concedes that there were actually no significant changes in vocal style between the late 18th century and the early 19th century, meaning they were basically still stylistically the same. Furthermore, Mozart was well recognized by 19th century bel canto composers like Rossini. In a fateful meeting between Rossini and the young Richard Wagner in Paris in 1860, the two discussed a variety of musical topics and also referred to Mozart, where he said, "I don't know how to tell you strongly how much I admire those masters for that subtle science, that certainty which is so natural to them in the art of composing. I've always envied them that, but it must be learned on the school benches, and one must also be a Mozart to know how to profit by it." He was referring to Mozart and Haydn. Showing Rossini was a bel canto composer, was deeply inspired and knew who Mozart was and was very impressed. There were also compositional techniques used for storytelling continued to be used. Remember those experimenting with opera buffa? It continued to be expanded on. This leads to even more rhythmic and harmonic variation by early 19th century composers. His early 19th century operas also have a variety of ensembles, like Mozart did. And his using binary forms for his operas lead to the cavatina cavaletta form, a two-part A prime B form, made up of a slower, twice-repeated section called the cavatina, followed by a quicker and more florid section called the cavaletta. Examples are Una voce poco fa, Il Barbiere di Siviglia by Rossini, and oddly enough, Batti Batti o bel mazzetto as an early version by Mozart in Don Giovanni at the Ponte opera. The second counterpart states that modern performers of Mozart opera state they are stylistically different and therefore should be sung differently. This proponent is Francisco Araiza, a Mexican tenor and prominent singer of, according to the second definition, bel canto and Mozart opera. He was labeled by Festspiele magazine as the leading Mozart tenor of the day in 1990. He believes that they're completely different, that singing bel canto offers more freedoms than Mozart opera, that bel canto can use embellishments like portamenti while Mozart opera only allows for dynamic flexibility, and that Mozart opera should be sung in a more instrumental style with little to no variation on tempo, unlike bel canto opera. He does concede on Don Ottavio's aria from Don Giovanni, Dalla sua pace, as being more bel canto. But his conjectures are not backed up by historical records. There are lots of instances of vocal freedom in improvisation. They just weren't notated. According to Klein, portamenti also played an exceedingly important part in singing Mozart, so long as it wasn't overused. And finally, an instrumental approach was often prized in bel canto singing, as seen in this quote by Aaron Klein. There are also examples of bel canto singers who sang both Mozart and Bellini, Rossini and Donizetti, and sang them the exact same way. For the interest of time, I cannot show you Nelly Melva's Lucia di Lammermoor, but she did sing them with the same technique as she sang Cherubino from Mozart's Le Nozze di Figaro. Here's our example. My conclusion is that due to these numerous similarities within the music and ideals, proximity to masters and techniques, one can conclude that these three operas are part of the bel canto tradition. And that raises more questions. Are there connections between Mozart and his other Italian-style operas like Idomeneo, La Clemenza di Tito, and bel canto? Or his Germanic Singspiel productions like the Zauberflöte or the Abductions in the Zeralia? And on a more macro scale, what are other topics in music that are analyzed separately but may be connected, either directly or peripherally, that we don't consider? Finally, there's a note on future of performing Mozart. Historical performance practice is a source of interest among historical performance groups and in training programs for singers. And this study may influence how singers are taught to sing operas, maybe taught to be sung with more bel canto techniques, or include more ornaments, which can provide both. As a result, this study provides both performers and researchers with more historically informed details on the workspace study/perform, which can lead to a deeper understanding on how they are performed and created. Thank you.
Thanks, Allegra, for getting us off to a sensational start. Does anybody have any questions? Comments? I'll let you.
Yes.
So maybe I missed it, but did you allude to or find any information at all about whether Mozart and his contemporaries actually used the term bel canto?
They did not use the term bel canto. The term bel canto was not mentioned until the 19th century to refer to an older technique. This is a nostalgic term that just kind of, started referring to it, hence why we have mentioned. Maybe that is why there's that secondary definition, is because perhaps that term emerged at the time of Rossini Donizetti, but it actually referred to 2 centuries.
Yeah, I'm wondering if this is something just as simple as like, okay, you have a phenomenon going on for a while, but it takes decades, if not centuries, for somebody to smack a label on it.
I am guessing that they also called it Old Italian school, and like just way of singing.
Bel canto seems in a lot of ways like sort of just the most comprehensive approach to singing.
Yes.
Are there teachers out there that are teaching something like that called something else that has other elements? It just seems like such a sort of foundational thing. I'm just curious.
I think that a lot of teachers may go and teach and say that it's bel canto, but due to the existence of all of these pedagogical manuals and treatises that are written that say exactly how you teach this, not all teachers teach those exact things. So I was more looking at it through the more exact lens of what is featured in the source material, in the pedagogical manuals, which nowadays there are different styles of singing, which not all of them are going to be classical style. And even of the classical singing, there are different styles within them. There's the German school, which teaches completely different pedagogy, influences on how you stand, how you breathe. So different countries in Europe had different traditions. Bel canto specifically more refers to what was taught in Italy.
And just a little follow-up. Have you come across things? It seems like perhaps the reason the bel canto was transmitted so effectively during that time, even before it was called that, had to do with the students living with their teachers and so that it was more, not like an hour a week or whatever.
The students would be taught by their teachers, and then they would go and teach their students what their teachers were teaching them. So this was kind of a tradition that was passed around. It's also spread because opera was incredibly popular in this period of time. During this time, there were hundreds and hundreds of new operas being performed. This was people's form of entertainment. And today it may seem rather odd of how it could be easily passed around so fast, because opera does not take as big a role in music, at least definitely in the US. It could be different in other countries like Europe, for example, which still has a very strong opera tradition, maybe because it was where it was invented. But it was so popular, plus there were releasing treatises which were being printed and dispersed to this public. Lots of people learned music. It was a very popular pastime for people, even if they weren't professionals. Opera was incredibly popular for people to go to, both for nobility and for ordinary people. So there was lots of opportunity for it to spread, even just by word of mouth.
Thank you.
Yes.
Excuse me. Do you have other audio or video examples you could give for the presentation?
There's so much audio. There's Fazzini, who is also considered a bel canto singer, recorded, because the 18th century singers, we sadly have no recordings, so we can only look at the students of Marchesi and Garcia.
Yeah, they like ready available, you can play that.
I can continue playing some more Nova for you. I can actually see if I can find her Lucia di Napoli, so you can hear what she sounded like singing that.
We have about 2 minutes.
But we have only about 2 minutes. So if we have time, if anyone else has any questions, I would say it now, we can hear some more.
I have a question.
Yes.
Why do you think it is that the definition of bel canto became so contested? Why has the definition changed so much over time?
I think there's, what I'm really seeing is a difference between scholarly and performing definitions. In performing circles, they go by the secondary definition. What I was taught in school as a performing classical singer is bel canto is the early 19th century. Mozart is this, bel canto is this, they're not the same. While in more scholarly sources, it's less. It's a different definition, they use a completely different definition. And then there are even arguments within performing circles about, do we continue teaching bel canto? What is the real bel canto way of teaching? What is the tradition, et cetera, et cetera. It's maybe also because the term is so, it's a nostalgic term, it seems very fluid, superfluous, people have more of a tendency to argue over it, and they didn't really, something over the years kind of shifted over it, and performing circles and scholarly circles started to diverge. And then, as well as that, bel canto wasn't even talked about, except during bel canto revivals. Then they would move on to a different type of singing. And then different countries, again, would have different singing traditions. So that it becomes more contested and murky as we get lots of different opinions between performers, scholars of it, people who are doing it on the ground, people are talking about it, which is very okay. And even in pedagogy. Pedagogy is not an exact science. If anyone has taught voice, there are 50 million different opinions on how you teach voice. Laura.
I was wondering if there's anything about like Mozart's relationship to Ponte, or like Ponte's storytelling that particularly lends itself to, like, in considering like the ground of it and like how he did these different styles,
Yes.
if there's like some connection there.
I mean, Ponte was funny. Ponte was really good at writing libretto. He was famous for a reason. He had, they collaborated incredibly well with each other. They knew how to kind of play off of each other according to what I've read and what I've learned and what people have told me as a singer as well, that they worked very well together, and that Ponte's libretto really lent itself to having all of these new styles for momentum, musical momentum, plot direction, because he's using more gritty, hybrid, dramatic plots that are less good guy, bad guy. Good guys do kind of bad things, bad guys do kind of good things. The servant is fooling the count. The peasants are running the show, and the nobility is just being played, which is very interesting also for this time. So his plots are more convoluted, more complex than what had been seen previously. And so to have these more complex plots, you have to write music that heightens them, that shows it off, that brings it to the fore and makes it funny for the audience, because a lot of these are comedies, and also can be satirical, can poke at social structures, society, and even go and bring into concepts like it's more complex plots, and overall requires more complex music. So.
I think we'll need to draw a line under it after Laura's question. So thank you very much, Allegra.